"It's a bit rough out here," another student said. "Not at all," Hawk replied. "What if we're in the middle of a shipping lane?" "Sometimes a shipping lane is a perfect place to be," he said, laughing. They all looked around nervously. "Relax," he said, "we're not in the middle of a shipping lane." One of the women had pulled a bottle of wine out and was looking for a corkscrew. "I didn't know this was a party," Hawk said. "I generally like to have a little wine before I rock my sextant," the woman said. The other women giggled, and Hawk hoped he wasn't blushing. "You ladies are relentless," he said. "We prefer to think of ourselves as focused." "I think you'll focus better without the wine," he said. "You're not very playful," the woman sounded disappointed. "Work now, play later," Hawk said, taking the bottle and putting it back in the bag. They got out their notebooks and their plastic sextants, things Hawk hated but had to admit were adequate for this class. He kept one of them himself as a backup, though if he had to, he could get a reading without a sextant at all. Watches were another matter. In order to get an accurate reading, you had to track Greenwich Mean Time to the second. If you spent enough time on the water, you planned for all possible worst-case scenarios. He knew at least 3 sailors who had horror stories about failed GPS devices. Some were ocean legend, but he knew at least a few of them were true. Tonight, the ladies were all wearing quartz wristwatches, something you didn't see much in these days of cell phones. Hawk turned down the shortwave and tuned into WWV to sync with Greenwich Mean Time. He listened to the tick and the tones until the time was announced, and he looked on as the women checked their watches. So far, they seemed to know what they were doing, a good sign, he thought. Only one of the women hadn't brought a watch, and he quietly handed her his. He had at least 2 more of them in the cabin, more worst-case scenario planning. It was possible to figure Greenwich Mean Time by taking moon sights, but it was difficult and not nearly as accurate, and he didn't like to do it, except in an extreme emergency. He wasn't going to even bring up moon sights tonight. He didn't want to confuse them. Let them master using the sextant first. Hawk checked the sunset. In the distance, the landscape of Boston glimmered red and purple. Seeing the trace of Boston skyline, Hawk's mind jumped to Lily Braden and her fall into those same waters. Though it hadn't happened that way at all, in his mind's eye her fall was in slow motion, the cell phone falling with her as it dropped out of her hand. It seemed such a surreal sight that his mind played it in slow motion, frame by frame, until she disappeared into the shining sapphire of the water below, slow, dreamlike, almost impossible to believe, even in memory. Quickly he turned away from the image and in the opposite direction toward the horizon line. The sun had set about 10 minutes ago. It was twilight. "Check your watches," he said. "It's time. Tonight we're going to fix our position on at least 2 of the 3 stars you've chosen. With any luck, we'll be able to see all 3. They should be low on the horizon. This won't be like the sights you took from the Friendship. There's a lot more motion out here. You want to rock the sextants back and forth, watching their arc, and keep adjusting until the star you sight is sitting directly on the horizon line." "Don't worry," he said. "These instruments are built for rough waters. It's actually easier to get a reading on a moving ship than from a fixed position." He walked back and forth, helping the women position their instruments. "Don't be fooled by the planets," he said. "We're looking for stars. Planets look more like discs. They don't twinkle." It took a while, but they all seemed to get it. When they began to take their readings, the group grew even quieter. The shyest of them gasped. Hawk leaned over and took a quick look at her sight and smiled at her. "Nice, huh?" he said. "Beautiful." She seemed amazed. He'd done this thousands of times, but it never failed to fill him with awe. There was a moment when you spotted that first star, a pinpoint of light, just where, if you'd done your calculations correctly, it was supposed to be in the sky. He'd heard it described as a religious experience. He wasn't sure about that. But when you spotted that first star, or when the stars crossed exactly where they were supposed to cross, there was nothing better. Even if you'd been dead reckoning in the middle of a storm, or if, overnight, the Gulf Stream had taken you 100 miles off course, if you had done your calculations properly, there would be a moment when you found that the star you were looking for was exactly where it should be, on the horizon. In that instance, the universe made sense, and you knew that no matter what else happened in the world, the stars would always tell you where you were, and when they did, you would always be able to find your way home. Happier note to end on, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. Did I forget anyone? Okay. Any questions?
How did you learn your navigation?
Oh, that was so hard. And I'm not really very proficient, but I have read so much, and I'm not sure I could navigate my way home from Boston with the stars. But if I had what you need, and I will read you what it is. Do you know about celestial navigation? It's
A little bit.
Little
Are
bit.
you a sailor or a stink pot?
I was a sailor growing up.
A stink pot movie.
Stink pots too, yes, absolutely stink pot. Our boat was a stink pot, but I sailed a little bit at Pleon Yacht Club in Marblehead, and then later I worked on Children's Island, which was the model island for the Lace Reader book. And we sailed out there. They had a sailing class, so that was fun. But we didn't do celestial navigation. And, you know, so I really studied. It's fun to study, you know, not half of this book, but I think the first, at least third of the writing was research for me. And I kept trying to get the theories right. And finally, you have to just go out and try it, because it makes a whole lot more sense when you do. But I was trying to understand the theory before I took my plastic sextant and went out and tried to position it and see some of the stars. I actually had a little bit of an easier time up in New Hampshire, where we have a house on a lake, because the stars are so much brighter, and every night I would be looking at the same things. So it got a little more obvious to me then. It's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's a poetic kind of wonderful thing that the stars are so constant, and that we are the ones that are moving. I mean, I knew it, but it doesn't seem that way when you watch them. And so it was a great realization for me on some level that I didn't understand before. Yes?
Was there anything you learned in your research that surprised you?
A lot. I read a lot about Hawthorne and Melville, and I mean, and their friendship. And there's a reading list that we've put on our website, because some of the books I read were wonderful, and I would highly recommend them. And of course, Moby Dick is one of my favorite books of all time, so I reread that. And because the house that is Finch's is set on Turner Street, across from the House of Seven Gables, I of course read that book again. And then every biography I could find on Hawthorne, so that I could create Finch's character. So I think it was all rather surprising me as I read it. But it's kind of thrilling to do that. And then, of course, I have quite an interest in psychology, and if you've read my first book, I think you know that. That was my minor in college, and I have a niece who is becoming a psychologist now, and so I have access to her whole school. Not really, but she'll take, if I have a question that needs to be debated, especially about ethics, she'll take it to class and give me several opinions on it, which is great.